Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph, and I am hoping that we will be learning today Daf Chav Ches Amud Aleph as well as the majority of Chav Ches Amud Beis. A little bit ambitious, but listen, we have to try. So of course we are continuing to learn Hilchos Tzitzis, and we pick up today actually on Chav Zayin Amud Beis, 2 lines off the bottom, Siman Tes Vav Sif Hey. Now, just as a brief little hakdama to Sif Hey, we need to remember we learned that there is an area on the corner of the talis or the talis cotton where the tzitzits are supposed to be placed. And that area is, we have to place the tzitzits no higher than gimel etzbos, than 3 finger breadths off the bottom of the beged. And the hole where the tzitzits go through have to be a minimum of maloi kesher agudel, the tip of the thumb, from the knuckle to the very tip of the thumb. The hole has to be at least that height off the corner. If it's less than that height off the corner, it's not called al hakanaf, it's called mitachas lakanaf, it's called under the corner. But it also can't be higher than 3 finger breadths off the bottom of the beged, because if it's higher than that, it's also not al hakanaf, it's not considered to be on the corner, rather it's on the beged proper, it's on the beged, it's not on the corner of the beged at all. The halacha that we're going to learn here in Sif Hey is affected by that requirement. So the Bechara says like this: Im nikra minekev shatzitzitz tali by ulamata. Let's say the hole that the tzitzit strings pass through becomes torn. Now, we reinforce the edge of the hole so that this should not happen, but occasionally it does happen. So you get a tear, and the hole essentially rips open, and it rips down towards the bottom of the beged. But it doesn't rip all the way through. It rips down so that now the tzitzits, instead of hanging on the hole, right, over here, you have the tzitzits. Let's see if we can just open this up so it's easier to see, right? The tzitzits are hanging on the hole. If that hole rips open down to the bottom of the beged, now the entire tzitzits tassel will move down. If it rips almost all the way down to the edge, you could have a scenario where the tzitzits tassel is actually just hanging on to the very edge of the garment all the way down here. Now, in that case, the tzitzits are no longer located on maloi kesher agudel off the bottom. Now the tzitzits are hanging all the way at the bottom. Is that a problem or not? That's the question that the Mechaber is addressing at the outset of Sif Hey. So says the Mechaber, Im nikra minekev shatzitzitz tali by ulamata, if the beged tears from the hole that the tzitzits are hanging in and downwards, and now the tzitzits are no longer distanced away from the bottom of the beged, a maloi kesher agudel, you no longer have that space. Says the Mechaber, Im kadam hatalas tzitzits lakera, Im kadam hatalas tzitzits lakera, if the tzitzits were placed onto the beged before the beged ripped. So when the tzitzits were attached to the beged, everything was fine. The hole was in the perfect spot and it was intact. So the tzitzits were located in the proper place. Sha'oisei tzitzits hayasham b'shas hakera, so that these tzitzits were there at the time that the beged ripped, kosher, then the tzitzits are kosher. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Yud Ches. Minekev, Mayri b'shaloi tefari. The first thing we have to understand here is that right now the Mechaber is addressing a case where the hole ripped open and you did not repair it. So far we're not talking about any repairs. We're talking about it ripped open, the tassel moved down, and now the tassel is hanging all the way at the bottom of the beged. V'kamash balad, and the Mechaber is coming to teach us, Afal gav deloi nishtayer maloi kesher agudel, even though you no longer have the proper distance from the bottom of the beged to where the tzitzits are hanging, you no longer have a maloi kesher agudel. Ukemoisha kasav la'el siman yud aleph sif yud. Yet, still in all, the tzitzis are kosher. And the Mishnah Berurah says this was really explained to us earlier in Siman Yud Aleph Sif Yud. D'loi be'inon shir zeh ela b'shas asiyah. We only need the minimum share of a maloi kesher agudel at the time that we make the tzitzits. It does not have to remain that way. As long as when we tied the tzitzits to the beged, we had the proper placement, even though the hole has now ripped open and the tassel was able to move down, the tzitzits are still kosher. V'im yirtza litvar hakara. Now let's say you want to go ahead and you want to make it nice l'chatchila. You want to go ahead and you want to repair it. So then it depends, says the Mechaber. Ima beged shel tzemer. If you're talking about a woolen talis katan or a woolen talis, so the beged is made out of wool. So yitferenu b'chutei sharminim. So then you could make this repair so long as you use thread that is not wool. What's at play over here? Well, now the Mishnah Berurah is going back to what we learned previously. We learned that you're not allowed to make a sewing repair on the bottom 3 finger breadths of the beged. And we learned 2 different reasons for that. One reason was the reasoning of Rashi. Rashi said, if you're going to do a sewing repair at the bottom of the beged, in the area where the tzitzis could be attached to the beged, in that bottom 3 finger breadths, anywhere from a maloi kesher agudel up to 3 finger breadths, that's the area that you can have the tzitzis attached to the beged. Said Rashi, in that area you cannot make a sewing repair. Why? Because if you make a sewing repair with a thread that theoretically could be used for tzitzis, we're afraid that you might come to combine that thread with 7 other strings and use it for tzitzis. So now, says the Mechaber like this. The first case that the Mechaber addressed over here was the hole tore down, the tzitzits moved down. Said the Mechaber, you should know it's kosher, and you do not have to make a repair. Now, says the Mishnah Berurah, what if you want to repair it? Well, if you want to repair it, then you're making a sewing repair on the beged in an area where theoretically you could attach the tzitzits. So you could do that if you make sure not to use a thread that could theoretically be used for tzitzits. So if the beged that you're talking about is a beged shel tzemer, it's a woolen beged, well then the only type of fabric you could use for tzitzit strings is wool. So fine, you want to make a sewing repair, make the sewing repair using cotton thread or using nylon thread. But don't use woolen thread. You can't use woolen thread. But if you use nylon thread, which can't be used for tzitzits, or you use cotton thread, which can't be used for tzitzits on a woolen garment, then you can make that repair. Ve'ein tzarech lahater es hatzitzis me'akanaf, and you do not have to untie the tzitzits from the corner before you make the repair, and then reattach it after you make the repair. There's no tasav v'lo also issue over here. Even though the hole ripped open and the tzitzits tassel moved down, it always remained kosher. That is kosher, because you only need maloi kosher agudel when you make the tzitzits. And this tear happened after you made the tzitzits. So ve'ein tzarech lahater es hatzitzis me'akanaf alaxel utlois ha'shein esakar shetofar. Kevin delay nifsal akanaf, because it never became puzzle. V'ima beged hu shel sharminim. Now, let's say the beged is not a woolen beged. Let's say it's a cotton beged. So it's a beged made out of another type of fabric. Also, l'tafrei b'chutin shel mina beged, l'das Rashi. So then, according to Rashi, you want to make that sewing repair, you cannot use thread that's made out of the same fabric as the garment. So if you have cotton tzitzits and the hole rips open, it's kosher. You want to make a sewing repair and you want to repair it? Well, you can't use cotton thread, because if you would use cotton thread, you would run into a problem according to Rashi. You're using cotton thread. We have to be chayshish that you might leave the extra cotton thread and combine it with tzitzits. Now you might ask, wait a second, what's the problem? Tzitzits are already here. So what do you mean we're afraid you're going to bring 7 other strings and combine the leftover sewing thread for tzitzits? I'm not making tzitzits, I already have tzitzits. The Mishnah Berurah explains that. This is a problem according to Rashi. Teshema yeshayar bachuta l'shem tzitzits. The concern is, you might come to leave the thread from the sewing repair over there, and you might seek to use it as tzitzis. You might combine it with 7 other threads and use it as tzitzis. V'after yesham tzitzis, and even though, what do you mean? Where's there room for concern? There are already tzitzits on this beged. I'm not going to use it for tzitzits. Says the Chofetz Chaim, loy plug bazeh. The Chachamim, when they made this decree, or Rashi, when we said that we have this concern, it's a loy plug. We don't differentiate between different cases. Once we say that you are not allowed to make a sewing repair at the bottom of the beged, lest you come to combine the leftover thread from the repair with other strings to make tzitzits, that takana applies even if there are tzitzits already on the beged. So if you would want to make that sewing repair, you wouldn't be able to use cotton thread. You would have to take nylon thread. The yoser toiv, and it would be even better, says the Chofetz Chaim, shalo yitferedu b'chut lavan, rat b'chut tzavua. If you are going to make that sewing repair, don't use white thread at all, no matter what it's made out of. Use blue thread or black thread. Because nowadays, when we do not have tchelis, right, we make all of our tzitzis strings white. So if you make a blue thread for your sewing repair or a black thread for your sewing repair, we don't have to worry that you're going to seek to use it as tzitzis because it's not white. That would take care of Rashi's concern. We would no longer have to be worried that you might come to use the thread from the sewing repair as tzitzis. Okay, so what have we addressed here so far in Sifhei? We know that the hole that the tzitzit strings pass through is supposed to be a maloi kesher agudel, the tip of the thumb, from the knuckle to the tip of the thumb. That's how far the hole is supposed to be from the bottom or from the edge, either on the side or at the bottom of the beged. Said the Mechaber, what happens if the hole, after you made your tzitzis were 100% kosher, then over time the hole ripped open and now the tzitzis tassel is hanging down lower. Now maybe it's all the way at the bottom of the beged. It's just hanging on by a little bit that's still intact. Said the Mechaber, that's kosher. You only need the proper placement, b'shas asiyah, when you actually make the tzitzis. After that, even if it rips, it's okay. Said the Mishnah Berurah, what if you want to make a repair? You don't want to walk around with a talis cotton that has that slit from the hole going down to the bottom. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you want to make the repair? Then you have to take into consideration what we learned in the previous year, that there's a shaila, there are times that you are not allowed to make a sewing repair in the area of the beged where the tzitzits could be placed. The bottom 3 finger breadths, up 1 maloi kasher agudel. You're not allowed to make a sewing repair over there. Said Rashi, why aren't you allowed to make that sewing repair? Because we're afraid you're going to make a sewing repair, you're going to have some leftover thread. Instead of snipping it off, you're going to take 7 other strings, bring it together with this string, and that's going to be your tzitzits. And you can't do that. Why? Because that string was not placed on the beged lishma. It wasn't there l'shem tzitzits. Another reason you might not be able to do it was because there are those that say that the tzitzit strings bedafka have to hang on the beged. They have to go through a hole and hang, not be an actual part of the beged. But in any case, that would be puzzle. You wouldn't be allowed to use that sewing string as part of the tzitzits. Therefore, you cannot make a sewing repair. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you want to make the sewing repair? There's an eitzah. What's the eitzah? Use a thread for the sewing repair that you cannot possibly use for tzitzits. What would that be? Well, either don't make it white, make it black, blue, red, but some color that we don't use for tzitzit strings, or use a fabric that we can't use for tzitzit strings. What would that be? Well, if your talis cotton or your talis is wool, then the only kind of fabric you could use for tzitzit strings is wool. So use something other than wool. If you use cotton thread for the sewing repair, we can't worry that you're going to combine it to use at tzitzits, because cotton tzitzit strings can't patter a woolen beged. You have a cotton pair of tzitzits and you want to make a sewing repair, use nylon thread. Again, then we don't have to worry, because in a cotton beged, you got to use either cotton or wool to make the tzitzits. You use nylon for your sewing repair, we're not worried that you're going to seek to use that as tzitzits. Okay, now let's go weiter in the Mechaber. Bottom line, Chavzayin of days. Another case. How about if you have the beged and you did not yet put tzitzits on the beged? So you have the beged without tzitzis. V'im nikra. Now, the same thing happened. The hole ripped open. V'nishtayir mimenu kolshehu. But it's still attached all the way at the bottom or all the way on the side. It's still attached. So again, the same scenario as we had before, except now you don't have tzitzis in the beged. You had your beautiful beged of dal kanfas ready to go. Maybe you already put tzitzis on 3 corners. Now on the 4th corner you don't have tzitzis, and something happened and somehow the hole ripped open all the way down to the bottom or all the way out to the side. It ripped, but it's still somewhat attached. Utfarai, and now you went ahead and you repaired it. And now after you repaired it, you put on tzitzits. And now you want to know, is this kosher? Well, says the Mechaber like this. Im hu shel tzemer, if the beged is a woolen beged, kosher l'kulei alma, then according to everybody this is kosher. So let's put on our thinking caps here and analyze the case. You had the beged without tzitzits on it. The hole ripped open. Okay, right now you can't put tzitzits on that corner. Because if you put tzitzits on that corner right now the way it is with the hole torn open, the tzitzits aren't going to be in the right place. They're not going to be a maloi kesher agadol off the bottom. They're going to fall all the way to the bottom. So right now, the way it is now, you cannot put tzitzits on. So okay, you take out your trusting sewing machine or needle and thread, and you sewed up the slit. And now you closed it up again, and now you have the hole in the proper place. Could you put tzitzits on it now? Says the Mechaber, it depends. If it's a woolen garment, then the answer is yes, no problem, it's kosher l'kuli alma. What does the Mechaber mean it's kosher l'kuli alma? Very simple. This again goes back to the shaila of making a sewing repair in the area of the beged where you're allowed to put the tzitzits. So, says the Mechaber, according to Rashi, what's the problem with the sewing repair? The problem is you might come to use the sewing thread as your tzitzits. So says the Mechaber, over here it's not a problem. Why? Because it's a beged shel tzemer, it's a woolen beged, and the Mechaber said earlier already that at least in his times it was not common, or not just not common, they did not use woolen thread for sewing repairs. So you have a woolen beged, you're gonna make it, you made a sewing repair, you didn't use woolen thread. If you didn't use woolen thread, you can't possibly combine it to be tzitzits. So there's no problem here whatsoever. Take the tzitzits now, tie them on, it's 100% kosher. What was the other possible concern with sewing repairs in that area of the beged? The sheet of Rav Amram. Rav Amram said the problem with the sewing repair at the bottom of the beged is if a piece of the beged tears off, and that piece is less than 3 finger breadths, then it doesn't have Torah's beged. If a piece that is so small that it does not have a Torah's beged rips off the beged and you reattach it to the beged, it's not called reattached. And now if you try to put tzitzits on that piece, you're not attaching the tzitzits to the beged. You're attaching the tzitzits to a small piece of fabric that's not even considered to be attached to the beged. So it's not kosher. Does that apply in our case? No. We're not talking about where a piece tore off the beged. We're talking about where it slid open. And it didn't even open all the way. It was nishtayir kolshu. It remained attached. Either all the way at the bottom or all the way on the side, it remained attached. So nothing ever tore off. So then Rav Amram's concern is not germane. So the only concern that could possibly be negeya over here is Rashi's concern. If you're talking about a beged shel tzemer, we don't have Rashi's concern. And that's why the Mechaber said, Im hu shel tzemer kosher l'kulei alma. That was a mouthful. Let's see it inside in the Mishnah Berurah. He's cutting you a test. Says the Mishnah Berurah, kosher l'kulei alma. The Rashi, because according to Rashi, kevan cha beged hu shel tzemer, since we're talking about a woolen beged, which you must use woolen tzitzit strings, ein halachos sheyishaya b'chutei sharminim l'shem tzitzits. We don't have to worry if you make a sewing thread using a different fabric, which you're going to do, because the Mechaber said they didn't use wool. We don't have to worry that you're going to use it l'shem tzitzits. Ul Rav Amram, and according to the other concern, Rav Amram's concern, it's not negeya. Why? Kevin the nishtayir kolshehu, since the piece never tore off, it just was cut almost all the way through, loinus batel mitaras beged. the area that you're tying the tzitzis onto never lost the chashivas of a beged because it always remained fully attached. It had a slit, but even the slit never went all the way through to the bottom of the garment. So it was never detached, and therefore it never lost the teres beged. The chanal b'sif hakaidim. The choshkein the yesh oimrim sheb'sif hakaidim kasher hacha. And certainly, according to the yesh oimrim in Rav Amram, we had another possible pshat in Rav Amram that said that according to Rav Amram, even if a piece tears off the beged completely, and then you sew it back on before you put the tzitzits on, that's okay. So certainly according to that shita, in our case, again, you're putting the tzitzits on after you make the sewing repair. So certainly it's okay. Okay. So now we just addressed a case where the hole ripped open, but it did not go all the way through to the bottom or to the side of the beged. You made the sewing repair, and then you put tzitzits on. So we said, if the beged was tzemer, it's kosher l'kuli alma. Now, how about if the beged is not tzemer? How about if the beged is made out of some kind of other fabric? Says the Mechaber, top line, v'im hu shel shar minim, let's say the beged is made out of a different fabric, shederech litvar b'chutin shaloi sayamin, and it's a fabric that you do make sewing thread out of. So let's say it's a cotton beged, and let's say you have plenty of cotton sewing threads. So then, says the Mechaber, lo yitfar l'das Rashi. So then, according to Rashi, you're not allowed to do this. Again, what's the problem? You have the beged, the hole ripped, you want to make a sewing repair. Where are you making that sewing repair? You're making it in the area where you're allowed to put tzitzits. You're making it in the bottom 3 finger breadths, from 1 maloi kesher agudel up to a maximum of 3 finger breadths high. You want to make a sewing repair over there? Well, according to Rashi, you're not allowed to, because you have a cotton beged. If you use cotton sewing thread, we have to be concerned you might come to combine the leftover cotton sewing thread with 7 other strings and make tzitzits out of it. So says the Mechaber, imu shel shar minim, if the beged is made out of a different fabric other than tzemer, shederech litvar b'chutin shaloi sayamin, and it is common to use sewing threads made out of that fabric, then lo yitvar lo das Rashi, that according to Rashi, you're not allowed to make a sewing repair using that kind of thread in that area. Says the Mishnah Berurah, lo yitvar, loymar, what the Mechaber means is, ba'oisai hamin. If it's a cotton beged, you can't make the sewing repair with cotton thread. If it's a silk beged, you cannot make the sewing repair with silk thread, because you might come to combine that thread with other strings of like fabric to make tzitzits. But if it's a cotton beged and you want to use silk thread, then you could make the sewing repair. Aval b'menacher yesh lahakel. And again, the Chavetz Chaim says a very practical eitzah: just use a different color. Don't make the sewing thread white. And then again, we obviate the concern that you might use it for tzitzits. Continues the Mechaber, second line down, a little past the middle of the line. V'im nikra. Now, and it's funny because the Mechaber phraseology is not so clear. It's Torah Shabal Peh, not Torah Shabiksav. V'im nikra. Now let's say the hole tears, and now we're changing the case a little bit. V'im nikra, if it tears all the way through. Till now, we were talking about where the hole tore, but it did not go all the way through the bottom of the beged or all the way through to the side of the beged so that the tzitzis tassel could come all the way out. We were talking until now that it tore, but it never penetrated the edge of the beged. Now, says the Mechaber, v'im nikra. Let's say it tore all the way through. Utafaroi. And then you repaired it. You sewed it closed. Va'achakach hittel by tzitzits, and then you put tzitzits on the beged, ikalusapuke. Now, the Mechaber says we have a suffix whether or not this is kosher. Very interesting. Let's see a very interesting Mishnah Berurah here. V'im nikra. Ritzonei loymar. First of all, what does the Mechaber mean, v'im nikra? What does he mean that it tore? What is precisely the case? Ritzonei loymar, the Mechaber wants to say shenikra kula. it ripped entirely. Minekev, from the hole, ad soif hasafa, all the way through the edge of the beged. Lachein ikalasapuke. Since it tore all the way through, and then you repaired it, and then you put on tzitzis, that's why here it's different, and here we have a suffix whether or not this is kosher. What's the suffix? Let's see. Da'af ima beged hu shel tzemer, even if we're talking about a woolen garment, v'yitferenu b'chutei sharminim, and you'll make the sewing repair with some other type of fabric, let's say with cotton threads, Dila Rashi b'vadai mutter. So according to Rashi, everything is okay. What's the problem? You had a beged, it tore. Okay. You made a sewing repair. Now, is the sewing repair a problem? No. Why? Because it's a woolen garment and you used cotton thread. So we're not worried that you're going to incorporate that thread into your tzitzis. So the sewing repair is not problematic at all. Now you take tzitzis, you put tzitzis on the beged, they're going to be in the perfect place. They're going to be a mole kasher a gudel up from the bottom, and they're going to be no higher than 3 finger breadths. What's the problem? According to Rashi, everything is okay. All right, how about Rav Amram? Afilu hachi efshir del Rav Amram puzzle. But according to Rav Amram, this might be puzzle. Now, before we read it inside, I'm going to give you the background over here. Let's remember, according to Rav Amram, what's the problem with the sewing repair at the bottom of the beged? So the basic case and the basic concern of Rav Amram is, we know from Hilchas Tumah V'Tayra that in order for a piece of fabric to be considered a beged, it has to be at least shalosh al shalosh. Less than shalosh al shalosh is not a beged. In the words of the Chavetz Chaim, it does not have Torah's beged. It's not considered a beged. Therefore, said Rav Amram, if a piece tears off of the talus cotton or the talus, it was physically removed, and that piece is less than shalosh al shalosh, now you go ahead and you sew it back onto the garment. Rav Amram says that doesn't work. Why? Because the reattachment is not considered a valid reattachment. That piece of the beged that tore off will always be considered torn off of the garment. Why? You reattached it, you sewed it back on, but it seems that the reasoning of Rav Amram is that when a piece that does not have Torah's beged is attached to a beged, it does not itself become part of the beged. We look at it that the beged ends at the seam. That piece is not choshev enough to be considered reincorporated into the beged. As long as it was part of the beged, it was part of the beged. But it tore off. When it tore off, it lost the Torah's beged because it's too small. You went in and you stitched it back on. Rav Amram says we don't recognize that stitching. It's not considered attached. It's kapasik dummy. It's as if it's forever removed from the beged. Now, that piece has a hole in it and you put tzitzit strings on it. You can't pot to the beged. The tzitzit strings are not even considered to be attached to the beged. That's Rav Amram's concern. Now, in our case, nothing actually tore off of the beged. We're not talking about a case where a piece tore off the beged. We're talking about where the hole got torn open, but it tore all the way through to the bottom. So it's like a flap. It's hanging. The suffix of the mechaber is, we know that Rav Amram says that if a piece that's less than shalosh al shalosh tears off of the beged, we don't recognize the stitching repair, we don't recognize the sewing repair as reattaching it. Now in our case, it didn't physically come off of the beged. It's still attached to the beged. But it's a flap that's hanging loose. And that flap is less than shalosh al shalosh. When we do a sewing repair now, do we recognize that sewing repair? If we recognize that sewing repair, then the rip is closed, and we have a hole, and we tie the tzitzis onto the hole, and it's hanging on the beged. But if we don't recognize the sewing repair, then the slit is still open. And then even though the tzitzis are hanging on the hole, halachically they're not. Because halachically, they're hanging on to a seam that halachically doesn't exist. halachically, it's as if that seam is open. So the suffix is, how far do we take Rav Amram? Is Rav Amram's concern only when the piece is completely physically removed from the garment? Or does Rav Amram's concern also negea to a case where the slit went all the way through and we have a hanging flap? That's the suffix. So again, according to Rashi, everything is okay. According to Rav Amram, we have a suffix. Let's see it inside. Eiskan Chaf Aleph. I got to go a little bit easier on my voice. Baruch Hashem, it's coming back, but if I raise my voice and I get all excited like this, I'm going to lose it again. But it's hard. It's just so geschmack. So we're in Mishnah Berurah, Eiskan Chaf Aleph, 2 lines down in the wide line near the end of the line. So even though we've seen that according to Rashi, everything seems to be fine here, Afilu Hachi still in all, says the Mishnah Berurah, Efsher, it's possible the Rav Amram puzzle. It's possible that this scenario would be puzzle according to Rav Amram. Why? The cave underline Nishtayr Kol Shehu, because since in this scenario, in this case, the slit went all the way through to the bottom or all the way through to the side, and in that rip, no part of that rip is still attached to the garment. It's a hanging flap. We saw in the previous sif, the Ladeya Harishayna, that according to the first explanation of Rav Amram, Kiman de Pasik Dami, even after you make a repair, it's considered as if the piece is still removed. V'lo yoyel tefira, and a sewing repair is not efficacious. Even though tzitzis weren't there yet, you're only going to put the tzitzis in after you make the repair, but we don't recognize the repair. The efsher, now, it's possible that Rav Amram's concern of the previous sif of sif Daled, it's possible, says the Mishnah Berurah, that Rav Amram's concern doesn't apply to our case. The efsher dahacha adif, it could be our case here. It's if hey is better. Tahaloya kanafu shalem mishneit stadav, because we're not talking about where the entire corner actually tore off the garment. We're talking about that it still is physically attached to the beged. It's only in one place where it's slit down to the bottom. V'rak be'emtza nifsak. It ripped down the middle. See, when he means down the middle, right? Here's your hole. It ripped down here, right? But it's still attached, right? This is a flap that's going to hang, and this is going to be a flap. But it's attached up here, and it's attached up here. So it's not as if it ever became detached from the garment. So in Sif Dalet, in Sif Dalet by Rav Amram's case, the corner was physically totally removed from the garment. And over there, Rav Amram said we have a chash, maybe the reattachment is not considered a reattachment. But over here, it was never completely removed. And the Mishnah Berurah says, that's why the Mechaber says, Ikalo Sapuke. Because we don't know if, according to Rav Amram, this is problematic or not. Vayin B'taz, however, the Mishnah Berurah says, you could look at the Taz in Sifkat and Daled, Shecholik, who disagrees with this Mechaber. Upaisik Tehinkan Suffolk. He says he doesn't see a suffix here at all. The Taz says no. According to everybody, if you make this sewing repair and then you put in tzitzis, it's going to be kosher. Again, according to Rashi, it's not a problem because the sewing repair, you're going to use a different type of fabric, so you're not going to have a sewing thread that's a problem. And according to Rav Amram, you don't have a piece that was ever physically removed. Now again, it has to be that you put the tzitzits on after you make the repair. Because if you try to put the tzitzits on before you make the repair, then the tzitzits aren't going to be in the proper place. They're not going to be a balei kasher agudel off the bottom of the beged because the hole is ripped open. However, the Mishnah Berurah says, don't get involved in this suffix. Instead, what you should do is take a square of fabric that's at least shalosh al shalosh and stitch it to the underside of the corner of the garment and make a hole in it and put the tzitzits in. That way you have no problem. According to Rashi, you have no problem because the sewing repair is not problematic. According to Rav Amram, you have no problem because you stitched on another whole piece that's gimel al gimel, and it has a taras beged. V'im ef shaloi, if this is not practicable, yesh lahakal kataz. If you're stuck, you can be making like the taz. The balavachi, because even without the taz, halakasavdu b'sif katan tezvav. We said earlier in Mishnah Berurah is katan tezvav. The dasa achrayim, that is the conclusion of the achrayim. The tfira machshiv chibur, that a sewing repair does make a chibur. Umayel af benikra kanaf legamri memakaymai. And we said earlier that we paskin like the second opinion in Rav Amram, which is that a sewing repair is effective, and we do see the piece as being reconnected to the garment. Okay, wow, this took a lot longer than I hoped, so we're going to go on to Sivav, and we'll definitely finish the Siman, but I might have to make a separate share out of going weiter, out of going into Siman Tezayin. Okay, let's see. Sivav in the Mechaber. Says the Mechaber. HaTorah chatichas beged bekanfei hatalos. If you do sew another piece of beged onto the corner of the talis, which is what we do. You can see it here in the picture. You have this beautiful square, right? This white square that's sewn onto the beged. This is exactly what the Mishnah Berurah is talking about when he says that we take a piece of fabric that's at least gimel on gimel. It's at least 3 finger breadths by 3 finger breadths, and we sew it to the corner of the beged. That way we know that the tzitzis is always attached to a piece of beged that has Torah's beged. So even if the beged proper somehow had a tear and there was a piece that was reattached, but we see very clearly that this piece, this square, is intact, and it is big enough to have a Torah's beged. So its attachment to the beged proper is certainly a valid attachment, and we certainly have the tzitzis attached to a beged. So now, says the Mechaber, realize that when you do that, you're making a sewing repair down near the bottom of the beged, right? Because you have this stitching that is stitching this square onto the beged. So says the Mechaber, HaTorah chatichas beged bekanfei hatalis. Whenever you attach a piece of fabric to the corners of the beged, and the stitching that we make around the hole that the tzitzis pass through in order to reinforce the hole, if you're talking about a silk beged, v'toifroi b'chut meshi lavan, and you do that sewing with white silk thread, yesh lachush b'davar l'das Rashi. So now you have a concern, according to Rashi, shaloi teishum tfira lamata b'shalosh ulamalu mikesha gudel. The Mechaber is just giving us a very practical heads up. The Mechaber is telling us, look, if you're going to do any stitching near the bottom of the beged, in the area where the tzitzis could be placed, so certainly the stitching that's around the hole, that is in the exact place where the tzitzis are going to go. So the Mechaber just warns us, and he says, keep in mind Rashi. Let's say this was not wool. Let's say this was silk. So if you have a silk beged, don't do that stitching with silk thread. Because if you do, you have just done a sewing repair in the exact spot where the tzitzis are going to go, and you did it with silk thread on a silk garment, and theoretically you could use a silk thread for tzitzis on a silk garment, and then we have the problem of Rashi, where we have to be concerned you might seek to incorporate the leftover thread into your tzitzis, and then it's possible, you're not allowed to do that. So the Mechaber is just he's warning us, remember everything that we've learned over here, and realize that we very often do sewing at the bottom of the garment, because we reinforce the hole, and we put an extra piece of fabric on the corner. Now in this case, it's not a problem. You know why? Because the stitching that stitches the corner on is a lot further out than 3 place. You're not allowed to put the tzitzis here. You're not allowed to put the tzitzis here. So this thread wouldn't be a problem. It's in the wrong place. But if we skimped on the fabric and we made that square a lot smaller, then the seam where the corner piece is attached to the beged proper could very likely be in the area that you're allowed to put tzitzis in. And then you would have Rashi's concern. So you would have to make sure to use thread that could not possibly be used as tzitzis. That's what the Mechaber is saying. Haga. And the Ramah just expands upon this a bit. And the Ramah says, V'hu adin, b'chol makom shetoifer, b'chut shehu min hatzitzis. This is something you have to keep in mind whenever you're doing a sewing repair near the bottom of the beged. If you're using a thread that is the min tzitzis, that is the type of fabric that could theoretically be used for tzitzis. The chayshinon, because according to Rashi, we have to worry, shema yikach oisei, you might seek to incorporate that thread, l'chutei tzitzis, to the threads, to the strings that you're going to use for tzitzis. Says the Mishnah Berurah Kal Chav Beis, shal meshi. The example that the Mechaber gave was if you have a beged of meshi, of silk, and you use sewing thread that's made out of silk. The imu shal tzemer, because if the beged is made out of wool, kvar nisbar de lochosh klal. Then the Mechaber has held earlier that you never worry because they didn't use woolen sewing thread. And then you could have stitching or any other kind of sewing in that area. Or if you have a talus made out of a different fabric like cotton, then you can't do that stitching with cotton thread. You only have this problem if you use sewing thread of that fabric. But if you use sewing thread of a different fabric, so if you have a cotton beged and you use nylon thread, yesh lahakal, it could be makel. Lavan. It's also only a problem if the sewing thread is white. Because if it's dyed a different color, then again there's no room to worry that you might use it. You might try to incorporate it in your tzitzit strings. Because we don't use colored tzitzits. Because this concern only applies to the area of the kanaf, of the corner, where you're allowed to put on tzitzits. The area between amaloi kusher agudel and 3 finger breadths. But if it's higher than 3 finger breadths, or further inboard than 3 finger breadths, or if the stitching is lower than a kesher agudel, again, there's no concern that you might use it for tzitzis. Because it's not in the right place for tzitzis. And to reinforce the hole, also litvar b'chot lavan, you should not use white thread. But our talesim shem shel tzemer, if you have a woolen beged, and lahakpit klal, because we don't use woolen sewing thread, so there's no problem. How about if you have a cotton beged, if you have cotton talus cotton, if you have a cotton talus cotton, then the stitching around the hole should not be done with cotton thread. You have to do it with a different type, a different min. The Ramah pointed out that this halacha is true any time that you're going to have any kind of stitching in that area. Ritzayin Loimar, the Ramah wants to say is, for example, im nikra, if the hole tore open, v'nishtari b'menu kolshu, and it was still partially attached, where we said you're allowed to stitch it up. Yes, you could stitch it up, but you have to be careful what kind of thread you use to stitch it up, so you shouldn't run into the problem of Rashi. Okay, that concludes Siman Tezvav. So this is another case of me vastly underestimating how long something was going to take. I thought we were going to do a whole other page within 45 minutes. Okay? Wasn't to be. I will attempt. I'll see if I'm able to do, because I'm already prepared. We'll see if I could somehow squeeze in an extra share so we could catch up a page. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. Schos of limud HaTorah should be begging against Klal Yisrael, the Baruch Shem Shesen, Yeshua's Refuah's Parnasset Shetuchim to all those in need, and we should be zeichet to see the Bias called Tzedek, B'meherav Yameinu, Amen. Be well.